Iran entered this conflict with approximately 45,000 missiles in its arsenal. The United States began with around 8,000, and according to multiple military sources, American stockpiles are now critically low. So ask yourself the real question: who is actually holding the upper hand here? You've been fed a particular narrative. Us and Israeli operations have crippled Iran's military. Analysts on television talk about 70%, even 80% degradation of Iranian launch capability. The headlines scream about massive strikes, obliterated targets, and an Iran that is supposedly broken and desperate. But here is what those headlines consistently fail to mention. Every single time a military spokesperson steps in front of a camera to describe how weakened Iran's missile forces have become, Iran launches another strike, a missile carrying a 1,000-pound warhead, and it lands precisely on its intended target. That is not the behavior of a degraded fighting force. That is the behavior of a force that has become more surgical, more disciplined, and more effective than before. The truth that no senior official in Washington is willing to speak openly is this: Iran no longer needs to fire hundreds of missiles at a time, because the missiles it does fire now strike exactly what they are aimed at. Precision has replaced volume, and that is a far more dangerous evolution if you want a complete picture of what is unfolding in the Gulf, not just the portions that are politically convenient. You are in the right place. This channel exists to cover what the mainstream press consistently overlooks. Here is the strategic reality Iran grasped from the very opening of this conflict. Wars are not decided by who fires the most. Wars are decided by who outlasts the other. Iran deliberately launched enormous missile waves in the early stages, not primarily to destroy infrastructure, but to exhaust enemy air defense reserves. Israel, the Gulf states, and the U.S. Navy all burned through their interceptor stockpiles chasing down that first wave of incoming fire. Now the United States is pulling THAAD radar systems and interceptor batteries out of South Korea and rushing them to Israel. Let that reality settle for a moment. The most powerful military on the planet is stripping air defense coverage from one of the world's most volatile flashpoints, the Korean Peninsula, in order to plug holes in Israel's defensive umbrella. That is not the posture of a campaign that is succeeding. That is the posture of a military stretched well beyond comfortable limits. And while global attention stays locked on missile counts and launch site assessments, Iran is quietly prevailing in an entirely separate dimension of this war. Ports in Oman are burning. Gulf energy infrastructure is under sustained attack. Regional alerts are being issued across multiple countries simultaneously. None of this requires a single ballistic missile. Every bit of it is being executed with drones, and Iran's drone production infrastructure has not been touched. That distinction matters enormously. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply passes every single day, does not require missiles to be held at risk. It requires drones, and Iran possesses thousands of them. Now, something far more alarming has entered the conversation. Reports from major American broadcast networks suggest Iran has begun mining the Strait of Hormuz. If accurate, this is no longer simply a regional military story. This becomes a direct threat to the architecture of the global economy, the U.S. Secretary of Energy briefly published a post claiming American naval vessels were actively escorting tankers through the Persian Gulf. That post was removed within hours. The reasons for that deletion have never been officially explained. Draw whatever conclusions that silence suggests to you. Part 2, 500 words. Let's examine the actual military picture, because the numbers tell a story far grimmer than anything appearing on cable news. The United States Army today is a shadow of what it represented 3 decades ago. In 1991, America fielded 800,000 active soldiers and successfully deployed 300,000 of them to the Arabian Peninsula for the Gulf War. That operational capacity simply no longer exists. The Marine Corps is lightly equipped. The Army is understaffed, and modern warfare, as the Ukraine conflict has demonstrated to every serious military observer on the planet, has transformed so fundamentally that ground forces are rendered nearly useless without absolute dominance of the airspace above them. Consider what that means for any scenario involving American troops operating anywhere near Iranian territory. Iran stretches nearly 1,000 miles at its widest point. The terrain is unforgiving, and like Russia operating in Ukraine, Iran maintains persistent satellite surveillance over everything that moves on the ground beneath. Any military buildup would be identified before the first unit finished staging. Ships carrying troops and heavy equipment would become targets before a single soldier stepped onto land. The gradual, methodical military buildup that proved effective against Iraq in 1990 would not be a campaign today. It would be a catastrophe. Here is an element of this conflict that Western media has almost entirely ignored. Israel struck an Iranian desalination facility. Iran operates more than 30 such plants and draws water from multiple river systems, so the strike did not meaningfully threaten Iran's water supply. But consider the implication carefully: the Gulf. The states are not in the same position. For nations like the way Qatar and Kuwait, desalination plants are not infrastructure, they are survival. They are the difference between a functioning society and a humanitarian emergency. Iran has already struck at least one desalination facility in the Gulf in direct retaliation. If this pattern continues, if Iran begins methodically targeting Gulf desalination infrastructure, entire populations face a water crisis of historic proportions. Israel also struck Iranian oil storage facilities, reportedly without prior coordination with Washington. Then the Jerusalem Post published claims suggesting the Way was actively participating in strikes against Iranian targets. The Way responded with immediate fury, issuing a flat denial and expressing deep anger at being misrepresented. So you have Israel striking infrastructure that could trigger a humanitarian catastrophe across the Gulf, manufacturing false narratives that attempt to pull neighboring states into a war they want no part of, and doing all of this while the United States continues to fund, arm, and shield it from consequences. The question worth sitting with is straightforward: who is actually directing this war? And whose interests does it genuinely serve? Now we arrive at the most consequential dimension of this entire story. Iran's previous supreme leader had issued a formal religious ruling prohibiting the development of nuclear weapons. That man is now dead, killed in an Israeli strike that also took the lives of his son, his wife, his daughter-in-law, his grandchildren, and several other family members in a single operation. His successor was already regarded as deeply skeptical of American intentions before any of this began. That individual has now watched his predecessor's entire family be eliminated, and the lesson every serious military analyst is extracting from this moment is cold and uncomplicated. Nations without nuclear weapons are exposed. Nations possessing nuclear weapons are left alone. North Korea has nuclear weapons. No one is bombing North Korea. Libya dismantled its weapons program under international pressure. Muammar Gaddafi was subsequently killed by forces his own government's collapse enabled. Iraq was invaded despite possessing no weapons of mass destruction whatsoever. Iran has observed every one of these outcomes, and voices within Iran are now almost certainly reaching a shared conclusion: none of this would have been possible against a nuclear-armed state. If Iran moves toward developing a nuclear weapon, and the strategic motivation has never been stronger than it is at this precise moment, Saudi Arabia has already signaled it will pursue the same capability. Turkey and Egypt would likely follow. The entire region enters a nuclear proliferation spiral, and Washington has no answer for that, because there was never a plan for what comes after destroying Iran. There was only a target. Here is the dimension of this conflict that will eventually reach every single person watching, regardless of whether they have any personal interest in Middle Eastern affairs. Energy prices across Europe have climbed between 70 and 90%. Across Asia, which sources the overwhelming majority of its oil from Gulf suppliers, prices have risen anywhere from 50 to 100%. Japan draws roughly 72% of its total oil supply from the Gulf. South Korea sources approximately 65 to 66% from the same region. Both are long-standing American allies. Both are furious. Industrial output, electricity costs, monetary policy, and every economic variable that flows downstream from energy pricing is being severely disrupted. Currency markets are experiencing volatility at extreme levels, and the global economy was already operating in a fragile condition before the first strike was ever launched. The only two nations that have derived measurable financial benefit from the disruption of Gulf oil supply are Russia, which is selling its own reserves at premium prices, two countries suddenly cut off from Gulf access, and the United States, particularly through expanded natural gas exports to European markets desperate for alternatives. Allow that to register fully. America went to war in the Middle East. Its closest allies absorbed the economic damage. Its strategic adversaries grew wealthier. President Trump now confronts what may define his entire presidency. He can pursue an exit, identify a path toward de-escalation, declare some form of victory, and begin withdrawing American exposure from the conflict. His history suggests he is capable of finding such exits when they serve him politically, but Iran has already stated, publicly it will not negotiate. Its position is explicit: you bombed us. You do not get a diplomatic arrangement now. And without active American military support, Israel is engaged in a war it cannot sustain independently. So what unfolds if America attempts to disengage and Israel refuses to stand down? What happens when missiles continue striking Israeli territory and the United States is no longer filling the defensive gap? Military analysts speaking privately are reaching an uncomfortable consensus. America cannot realistically walk away. The domestic political cost of being seen as abandoning Israel is considered prohibitive. Congressional relationships, significant portions of the financial sector, and large segments of the media landscape are deeply intertwined with Israeli interests. Any administration that attempts genuine disengagement faces consequences that could prove politically unsurvivable. This is the trap in its clearest form. The military campaign is deteriorating, the exit route is effectively sealed, and the only alternative being seriously discussed in certain circles: deploying ground forces to seize Karg Island, where over 90% of Iranian oil is processed, is something every credible military analyst describes as potentially catastrophic. The troop numbers are insufficient, the logistical chain cannot support it, and the modern battlefield would dismantle any such operation before it reached its objective. The post-World War I regional order constructed when Britain and France arbitrarily divided the Middle East according to their own imperial interests is finished. The era of unchallenged American military dominance across the Persian Gulf has ended, not through a single decisive defeat, but through gradual, visible erosion. The Gulf states have now watched America operate at full commitment and fail to protect them. Ports burning, desalination plants under threat, the U.S. Navy repositioning away from the strait rather than into it, because naval commanders understand their vessels are vulnerable to coordinated drone swarms and precision missile salvos. The Gulf states are registering all of this and drawing their own conclusions, and the conclusion they are reaching is that American protection can no longer be relied upon. Whoever fills that vacuum, whether China, Russia, or a regional framework constructed by the nations that actually inhabit the region, will not position America as its anchor. Russia emerges from this period stronger than it entered it. China is observing with careful patience, and Iran, struck repeatedly, with thousands of civilians killed and its cities bearing visible scars, has not surrendered, has not capitulated, and has not agreed to a single condition Washington demanded. This is a civilization. With over 2,700 years of continuous history, it has outlasted empires considerably more powerful than the current one. Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine continues. Russia's economy has been reinforced by elevated oil revenues. Europe is more economically exhausted and politically fractured than at any point in recent memory. Public pressure on European governments from populations paying drastically more for energy, populations who never supported this trajectory, is becoming politically impossible to absorb. Analysts now assess that Russia may capture Odessa before the year concludes. If that happens, what remains of Ukraine loses its entire maritime access. It becomes landlocked, economically strangled, and wholly dependent on whatever peace terms Moscow decides to extend. History is populated with moments when a nation concentrated so completely on the battle directly in front of it that it forfeited the larger strategic contest entirely. We may be living through precisely such a moment right now. The board is shifting in ways that will outlast every headline currently being written.